Good morning. So agriculture and emissions today, and that's come about because within DPIRD there's a lot of activity in the emissions space, and I've kind of been the cereals rep for that. But of course, as Jeremy said, you're far more familiar with seeing me talking about canola crops. So let's start there. So in canola research, we've moved on from looking at the benefits of early seeding, and we've jumped, and as you've all discovered too with these last couple of years with the great seasons we're having with the early starts, and we've jumped straight into agronomy for early sowing. So looking at the start of the year for where the rain was coming, I was hoping to have a site I could get back to in a day quite happily, but we've ended up out at Xantippe, east of Dalwallinu. They had 100 mils in March, and we sowed in March. Okay, so as for always for any nitrogen trials, when we've got obviously the rate of urea on the bottom and the yield on this axis, and with increasing rates of urea we had an increase in the yield, so we've hit nearly 3.5 tonnes there for some of those plots out at Xantippe, so very happy with that. And as always we get a reduction in the oil. Looking at the gross margin though, flattened up a bit at the top with increasing rates. And so then what we've done is put the emissions on there. And obviously you can see as we get increased rates of nitrogen fertiliser, we get increased emissions from the crop. So anything from 0.4 tonne at 65 kilos of urea up to 1.4 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare. So this is kind of where what I'd like for people to be at. So yes, the profitability and productivity is most important, but if we start looking at counting your emissions, measuring your emissions, and looking at opportunities to evaluate different mechanisms to reduce your emissions at no loss to profit or profitability. And the top line here is the gross margin. The one with the black line with the stars is where we've offset the gross margin by purchasing the carbon credits we need to sell carbon neutral grain. And you can see there's hardly any difference. It's currently $30 a tonne. So it's affordable. It's something that we can do. Okay, so why are we looking at the carbon account? I wanted to say at the start too, obviously in the room there's a range of experience, and for those of you that are all over this topic, I apologise. So I won't mind if you're on your phones. Why are we looking at the emissions? Are we doing it for the world? We all know about climate change, but we all need to do a little bit. Are we doing it for Albo? This is the picture from the Paris Agreement and fulfilling our Kyoto regulations, commitments. I think that's where I started out, but there's a lot of benefits in doing it for your own farm business. So we're looking at a customer pull. So we're talking about barley already maybe being sold into low emissions markets where we can expect to get a premium. We're getting a pull from industry. We've been selling canola obviously for many years with the International Sustainability Carbon Certification, the ISCC. So increasingly we might expect there'll be market pull for market access. And we've got ISCC Plus now for other grains. And also increasingly, we're expecting to see from our suppliers and our business partners that as they work through trying to manage their risk of exposure to climate change, that they'll be asking for a carbon account. So we're looking at some context, some anomalies that I see in agriculture for emissions reduction, and then we'll have a closer look at the agricultural emissions with opportunities to reduce and a focus on measuring those emissions. So when I looked at carbon, I had a lot of half-formed concepts a year ago, and it's been really interesting to do some deep dives. And I was really quite surprised at the amount of carbon in the soil system. So it's 55 trillion tonnes of carbon basically in storage. So as you can see from the size of the blocks, largely in the oceans, in the deep sediment of the ocean and in fossil fuels. And this little block up here, that's the size of the fast cycling component. So obviously we know about that. That's where we have the respiration and photosynthesis from plants and also from the phytoplankton in the ocean. And that's largely where agriculture operates. Then we've got the fossil fuels. And the fossil fuels are releasing the emissions from that storage point, where it actually is slow cycling, but slow cycling at the speed of rock weathering, and it's bringing those emissions up into the fast cycling zone. So, some would argue that's worse than where we operate in the fast cycling stage. And so between the fossil fuels, agriculture and others, we're contributing 9 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents into the atmosphere each year. And when I tried to do my little same size area, it was just a dot on the page compared with the 55 trillion tonnes of stored grain, but that's of stored emissions. But that 9 billion tonnes, in 20 years, that's the same amount as is in our whole fast cycling cycle. So it's quite important. So what can we do? So most emissions in Western Australia are from mining. No surprises there. Mining, manufacturing and electricity, with much less coming out of agriculture. And we'll talk about the different scopes in a minute. So these are some of the anomalies I see on a world stage looking at agriculture. In agriculture in Western Australia particularly, we've got much lower emissions. I'll find it. Top left. Here we go. So obviously much lower emissions in agriculture. In agriculture, we're at the fast cycle, which is probably less problematic than taking emissions out of the storage. Agriculture is more difficult to abate. We don't have solar cows or wind-grown crops, and these are available to mining industries. They've got a lot more technology that's at their fingertips. There's a lot of players in agriculture. So in Western Australia, we've got 4,000 growers, and on a world basis, there's 2 billion people employed by agriculture, so a quarter of the world's population. And agriculture, we're looking not just at the livelihoods of the people, but we're looking at biodiversity, at nutrition, and having enough food. What's that called? Food security, thank you. So some different considerations. So that's kind of where I started out, thinking, it's not fair, but it doesn't really matter. We still want to do our bit to save the world, and it's more important for our farm business to worry about, our own backyard anyway. So moving on, the emissions. Scope 1 emissions is what we're doing. So what's created and caused by you. And so given that we're speaking in agricultural context, that's inevitably on farm. But of course, everyone's got their own Scope 1 emissions. So if you're the fertiliser supplier, that's your Scope 1 emissions, what's coming out of your manufacturing plant. Scope 2, electricity. So we've got our two globes there. And as far as agriculture goes, that's negligible. Very low emissions from electricity because we've only got, the house and the workshop. And Scope 3 is everybody else doing everything else along the supply chain that contributes emissions. In terms, when we're talking farm carbon account, we commonly only include, though, the pre-farm emissions in that space. So Australia's got low emissions in general. So this is the comparison of the global emissions from canola production, and we're there in the orange. So you can see on a global scale, we're quite low. So definitely recommending people count their emissions, and it's probably going to be a good news story to find out. So let's look now at a closer look at the agricultural sector emissions, and they're dominated by the enteric emissions. So enteric just means it happens in the intestines, and obviously that's the ruminants contributing methane. Other ones are from the methane from manure management. A big one in agricultural soils, and we'll talk a lot about more in a minute, and liming and urea application have some CO2 emissions. Not all gases are the same. So carbon dioxide is our biggest greenhouse gas, and that's our standard. But if we want to compare apples with apples, we need to compare the warming potential of the different gases. So 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalents is the same warming as 1 tonne of methane has the same warming potential as 28 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So it's a lot more potent. It's got its absorption appearing in a different part of the spectrum. And nitrous oxide, extremely potent. 1 tonne of nitrous oxide is the same as 265 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. And that's happening largely in the infrared regions. And that's important for agriculture because a lot of our emissions, methane for the animals and nitrous oxide from our soils. So from the international community, we've got a book of formulas that largely maps where all of our emissions come from. And from part of that, in Western Australia, we've been able to fine-tune things. So where the evapotranspiration is at least 80% of the rainfall, we're having a lot less emissions from our agricultural soils. So there's reduced nitrification and denitrification, there's no leaching or runoff, and lower volatilisation. And that's because the soil spends more time being dry, there's not as much time for the microbes to be doing the emission processes. So this is our ag emissions from 1 tonne of urea for a start. So the denitrification and nitrification, nitrous oxide is either a byproduct of one or an intermediary of the other, and we just get it oozing from the system and accumulating in the atmosphere. So that's our biggest area of loss. And you can see the difference there. The orange is the low and medium rainfall zone, and the blue in the high rainfall zone. Volatilisation, obviously going to gas, leaching and runoff. Now all the nitrogen fertilisers are similar in those first 3 things for the proportion of nitrogen that's in the fertiliser, but urea has another area of loss. Carbon dioxide is absorbed when urea is formed, and so when the urea is used, that carbon dioxide is released. So it's got a slightly higher carbon footprint than the other nitrogen fertilisers. And we also have to consider the manufacturing emissions. So for urea, that's more than 1.5 tonnes. So for 1 tonne of urea, we've got a total of 4.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents of warming. And obviously a lot of that's because it's in some of the forms are from nitrous oxide, so a lot. But, it's not that we want to stop using urea. We don't want to stop using urea, we don't want to stop getting high yields. But we do want to see where we can reduce our volatilisation, where we can use our leaching, where we can have a better match of the nitrogen with the crop growth. So just some comparisons with the lime. Lime also releases carbon dioxide as it's neutralising. So that's got 0.4 of a tonne of emissions for every tonne that we use. And residue is the other big one. This looks like it's small here, but that's because I've only put in there 1 tonne of wheat. So if you're getting so the emissions from residue increase directly with our yields. So that's not something we want to focus on reducing. We want to increase that. Okay, so opportunities to reduce emissions. They're all things they're all things you're pretty much doing. Minimum traffic, controlled traffic, less fuel, potentially better growth in between. If we're talking about reducing emissions, we need to be reducing our nitrogen. So if we reduced our nitrogen by having a better match to needs. So we've got a variable rate, better timing to the crop demand, using more legume crops or pastures so we can reduce that nitrogen application, or the one that's new, I suppose, is moving into these slow release or released emission nitrogen fertilisers. And so anything that we can use inputs with a lower carbon footprint, so that's nitrogen fertilisers other than urea, so UAN, less emissions than urea. And the other one that's reliable is claying. So over time, if we're claying a light soil, then over time we can expect increased carbon storage from that. So just to balance about reducing your nitrogen to reduce emissions, or the other thing that obviously we do as growers, or you guys do as growers, is you want to use the same amount of nitrogen to get more product. That's good too, but it doesn't actually reduce our emissions. 5 minutes, good. And the other things that I just want to mention that are good, I mean, we want to keep liming. Liming might cost us emissions, but that's how we keep our productivity there. So yes, we want to keep liming. We want to do all the things that we know that looks after our soil. We want to retain our stubble, strategic tillage, sustainable rotations. So just to look at some of the work, this is from CSBP's new product that's coming, Urea Sustain. So we've got the applied nitrogen here with the yield, and compared with the urea, the Flexi-N gave us more yields, the urea plus Sustain more yields again, and using the one with the inhibitor, again, more nitrogen efficient. But as we move into these ones, which I guess we'll do with increasingly with the focus on emissions, we also need to wait until they've got, we need the emissions reduction quantified as well as their benefits for yield. So I think I missed the point of what we're doing with our, so we're definitely promoting a carbon balance. And when we've got the carbon balance, we can be selling our grain as carbon measured grain. We can be offsetting it with ACCUs to sell carbon neutral grain. And this is one of the ways. So there's various tools out there. This is the one that's, after multiple reviews, being the recommended one for Australian growers. So it's been developed by the University of Melbourne at their PIC, Primary Industries Climate Change Centre, and it's called the GRAINS GAF, the GRAINS Greenhouse Accounting Framework. And it's a really nice, simple Excel spreadsheet with relatively few inputs to put in, especially for cropping. And I recommend if you're starting, when we're promoting the continuing or starting this with your growers, and I definitely recommend starting with the cropping one before the animal one. And this is kind of what the output. We get each of the emissions breakdowns. So this is just for one crop I've done here, but we get the emissions breakdowns from where they come from and in terms of the different, whether it's on farm, scope 1 or the scope 3. Have I got time? Just. This is some model work, and I just want to show you some of the differences between the cropping and the livestock systems. So it's a model work by Sud Carell and others. And here, the orange is basically the orange is basically the fertiliser, the red is the enteric or rumen methane. And this one here is 100% crop, and this one's 50% crop, 50% livestock. No surprises, we all expect that we've got livestock in the system, your emissions will be higher. What was quite interesting to me to see that when we included the scope 1 emissions, the scope 3 emissions from your manufacturing, that difference was a lot less between the crop only and the livestock. And if we look again, comparing that with a lower input system or lower system at Carnamah, again, quite a difference relatively between the crops and the mixed system. But when we include our manufacturing emissions, that's very similar. So just a bit of a plug for livestock. So we've looked at some of the single emissions. This is looking at our total farm emissions. So this was the work from Wide Open Agriculture, CSBP and DPIRD, recent publication, really good resource. So 3,700 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents per year for the average farm that they looked at. And as we've seen, with the predominance on fertiliser, a residue, lime and fuel. So we might not yet, so we're recommending that people get this far and assess their own emissions. you might not have access to the premium market yet, and you might not need it for your suppliers yet. But if you're doing this, you're carbon ready, and then you can be carbon ready and relax and just wait as it all unfolds. I think before you do it, it's a bit of an unknown. So if we're getting into it, we can move further down the line as an industry together. Oh, so the average offset cost is only $10 per tonne of grain or $25 a hectare. So, you know, it's less than the sclerotinia outbreak, and it's going to be affordable for industry. So do it for your farm business. I think we should really engage with the carbon debate to make sure that agriculture gets its fair say. Count your emissions, look to reduce your emissions where you can while maintaining your yields and productivity. And also, as I spoke to people in industry, there's a lot of comment about enhancing our biodiversity. So that's, I guess, something to look forward to and expect in the future. Thank you.